Henry Bonsu on Times Radio.
Okay, to our big debate now. Today saw the sentencing of Britain's youngest murderer since the 1993 killing of James Bulger. Two boys who were aged just 12 when they attacked Shawn Seesahai with a machete in a Wolverhampton park have been sentenced to life with minimum terms of 8 years and 6 months. That came on the same day that two Just Stop Oil activists received 2 years behind bars for throwing soup at a painting of Van Gogh's Sunflowers, and a Southport rioter who was handed 3 years and 3 months. So what does these sentences tell us about our criminal justice system? Now, for our debate tonight, I've been speaking to Ashley Frawley, a sociology professor at Swansea University, and Chris Daw KC. I began with Chris. I asked him what he thought of the sentencing of the killers of Shawn Seesahai.
Well, I think it's appalling. I mean, it says something about a society that bays for the blood of children, whatever they've done wrong. Children at the age of 12 are so far from the point at which they can have insight, emotional maturity, or indeed to absorb deterrence, if deterrence is something that's being suggested is the purpose of these sentences. 12-year-olds don't sit around watching the news and listening to precisely what sentence somebody got in another courtroom. And the whole idea that sentencing is deterrent is ludicrous. But to pick up on the overarching point that you make about these sentences, they've not been sentenced to 8 years, 6 months. At the age of 12, they've been sentenced to life. And the earliest date of release for them is in 8 years and 6 months, and that will be almost double the age that they are now. So they'll have gone from 12 into their 20s. They'll have gone through secure children's homes, into a young offenders institution, and into adult prisons from the age of 12. That's all they have ahead of them until they're in their 20s. And I think it's an absolutely disgusting indictment on a society that we are that cruel to children, and that we don't treat them as we should, as someone that needs our support, that needs to be educated. Of course, the public need to be protected, but no one's going to tell me that any 12-year-old is going to be a danger to the public, that they need to be in prison for over 8 years. It's an absolute disgrace.
Chris, thank you for that. How would you respond, Ashley? Some of our listeners, and indeed I've been watching the comments on social media, and indeed listening to what the family of Shawn Seesahai, the 19-year-old who was murdered by the two defendants, have said, and they think it sends out the wrong message. And yes, they are children, but what they did was unspeakable.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's really difficult because the horror of the situation, the horror of the crime. So there's this understandable, perhaps, temptation, particularly on the part of the family, to say, lock them up and throw away the key. But we really do need to understand or remember or hold on to the fact that as a civilized society, we differentiate between adults and children. And what really concerns me is that we seem to be losing hold of that. And it's not just in this area, it's in other social issues. Increasingly, we want to give children all this responsibility to make consequential judgments about the course of their lives. I think we really need to rethink that trajectory. And it also calls into question, adulthood, right? If you're saying a 12-year-old is capable of making the same kinds of judgments with the same kinds of consequences as an adult, then we're really sort of diminishing what it means to be an adult in our society. And we need to remember that one of the most important advancements of modernity was actually the separation between adults and children, that, we don't marry children anymore. We don't, we recognize that there's a stage in life in which people are being socialized, they're becoming members of our society, and therefore we treat them differently. I feel like we're losing that, and that is very scary.
When it comes to the purpose of a sentence like this and all the remarks that the judge made, what capacity do we have, Ashley, to help rehabilitate children when they are 12 or 13, whether they understand the magnitude of what they've done or not at this age? How well set up is our system to transition them from where they have been to where we want them to be?
At the moment, not very well set up at all. There's actually a very big issue that I think is not talked about enough. The rehabilitation that tends to be used, a lot of the programs are not that effective. There's a lot of psychologization, which is fine. Obviously there's a psychological aspect to crime, but there are also enormous social aspects to crime in that they're they tend to be connected to poverty. It doesn't matter how much, behavior management you do on somebody. If you toss them back into the world they came out of, it's not like they're going to sit there and think, well, gee, I should take a breather and think 3 seconds. No, they're going to do what it makes sense to do in the milieu that they're coming from. So, rehabilitation has to have with it a sense of reintegration into society, the ability to, what is one of the biggest predictors of whether or not someone's going to reoffend? It's not whether or not they took a rehabilitation program. It's whether or not most of the times because they get too old, but whether or not they're going back into the same place that they just came out of, whether or not they have something to live for. Do you have something important in your life? If you're totally aimless and you have a meaningless life, that's, you're going back into a world of violence and crime. You're going to stay in that world of violence and crime. So what I'm concerned about is, we need to have a view, particularly with young children like this, a view to not just rehabilitation, but reintegration. And when you look at a crime like this, and it's almost like people see it as uniquely evil because it was done by children. It is uniquely horrendous and horrible and terrifying because it's so rare. It's actually very rare for children to do something like this, thankfully. But we see it as uniquely evil, and that makes it actually more difficult for people like this to reintegrate because they will carry that mark for the rest of their lives. And I think that's something that's very difficult to do to children, essentially. You're basically cutting off the ability to rehabilitate.
Thank you, Ashley. Nonetheless, Chris, judges are supposed to take all of that into account when they pass sentence, which is why they take their time, both in the court and prior to getting to the court, to decide what to do. What about the case of Joseph Corey? Because he's another person who was sentenced today. He is from Birkdale. He threw bricks at police officers, climbed on top of a carrier, took a riot shield, and he's pleaded guilty to violent disorder. And today he was sentenced to 3 years and 3 months. And some people have been saying on social media, well, it's too harsh. They're sending out a political message. This is wrong.
Well, I've been watching the sentences since the tragic events in Southport, the death of those children, and I've been watching the press coverage, and of course I've been observing what's been going on in the courts, including the case that you've just mentioned. And somehow or other, in a society where the prisons are so full that even sex offenders and violent offenders are being released randomly and early with no particular release plan in order to make room for the people who were throwing bricks or in some cases sending messages on Twitter, which had some connection to the rioting. So I don't really understand the direction of travel here. As a society, does anyone really believe that throwing one lot of people out of prisons early and unexpectedly, and then taking another however many hundreds more in for years and years because of the events of 1 or 2 or 3 days is a sensible, joined up, careful way to make decisions about sentencing, about the bigger issue of how you actually reduce crime and disorder generally, and violent and sexual crime in particular. It's just a knee-jerk random response by a government which has, frankly, since it's come into power with high hopes on a lot of us, it simply seems to be intent on doubling down on all of the mistaken policies of the last government and so many others in recent decades.
Well, Chris, it's like, let's look at economics. When you have a run on the pound, you have to take extraordinary measures. You get contagion. And wasn't that the concern of the government and, of course, the Crown Prosecution Service and then judges, that if they weren't seen to crack down extraordinarily at a febrile time, then we'd get contagion, just as we did in 2011 during those riots?
Yeah, but the idea that I can say that those who may be intent, many of them after a few beers, on getting involved in a sort of shouting match or bricking or throwing things at the police and the riot police, anyone that thinks that such a person who may be predisposed to do that is once again sitting there waiting for the latest news from Southwark Crown Court about whichever riot has just been sentenced, and then they'll make sure they stay indoors if that sentence is more than 2 years. Where the true sort of analysis of all of this is it's absolute nonsense. There is nothing in the concept of immediate deterrence by the use of the criminal courts, and worse than that, nobody cared whether it worked or didn't work. It was just being seen to do something. And you mentioned the CPS and the Director of Public Prosecutions, who's been, making media statements and talking about all of this and how he and the CPS were going to get tough on all these people. That's not their job. Their job is to make sensible, objective decisions about what's in the public interest when you apply the law, not to respond to politicians and journalists who are just clamouring for more arrests, more people in prison, and at the expense, as I say, of the whole system effectively collapsing into chaos, with people released only to reoffend in quite serious ways the very next day.
Okay. Actually, Chris is pretty sceptical. Actually, go further than that, Chris. Pretty damning of what's happened. But let's look at what appears to be the response to these sentences. People were up before the courts, sometimes within days of having been arrested by the police. And it really lasted only a week. It could have lasted a lot longer if these sentences hadn't been imposed really, really quickly. You might call it summary justice. What would you say about the societal effect of the response of what appears to have been a heavy set of sentences, such that even people like Elon Musk have been complaining about them?
If anything, it served as a confirmation for a lot of people that the police don't care about their issues. You get the police at your front door if you send a mean tweet, right? But you want to do something about crime that actually affects, working class people or poorer people. Forget about it. It doesn't matter. It's very, very difficult to get somebody to come down if you've been robbed or something like that. But, oh yeah, you're mean online. Why? Well, because mean speech hurts the middle classes. The middle classes are nice and insulated from violent crime. Okay, it happens every now and then, and it's a shame when it does. It's awful. But random violence is actually very rare. Crime is patterned, and it tends to affect the poor people in society. And the idea that you would just come down on these people, particularly after there was all these complaints in the press, very recent to this, about how the police were not bothering with a lot of crime, and all of a sudden, when there's a political message to be sent, now we can be efficient, now we can do something. It confirmed for a lot of people that the police don't care about the lower orders in this country. They only care about things that affect them.
But hang on, actually, a lot of victims were the so-called lower orders, ordinary working class people who happened to be brown or black in Manchester or Sheffield or Southport, and some of them were running for their lives. In my home city of Manchester, one black guy was literally set upon, you might have seen it on YouTube, by 20 people who appeared to want to kill him. And then there were others who were besieging asylum hotels or hostels, trying to burn people out. I mean, there had to be a strong response by the authorities, didn't there?
First of all, don't get me wrong. I'm not defending what happened. I'm just saying that how quick it was when there was a political message to be sent just shows how much they didn't care. They don't care about anything else. But when it's okay, we've got a new government, you have some disorder, you need to come down hard. So they can come down hard when they need to. They can be efficient when they need to, send people right to jail when they need to. But if you're a normal person dealing with violence and disruption and disorder every single day of your life, it's very difficult to get any kind of justice. That is the confirmation for a lot of people that they just don't care. I mean, if these were all isolated incidents, it's very difficult to get any kind of attention to these sorts of things. But it happens all at once, and it's a spectacle. And so you have a spectacular response.
So that was Ashley Frawley, a sociology professor at Swansea University, and Chris Daw KC,